Hello and welcome to the Everything is Black and White podcast. It's time for the Monday show with me, Andrew Musgrove, and our Newcastle United editor, Aaron Stokes. What a crazy weekend it has been for Newcastle United as the Magpies scrambled to avoid point deduction for failing to meet the PSR rules. In the end, thanks to the sale of Yankuba Minteh to Brighton, Elliot Anderson to Nottingham Forest, and Man United finally paying up for Dan Ashworth, Newcastle United look to have done enough to avoid any penalty. In this episode, we'll try to make sense of it all, just how we United left in such a position just days before a deadline that has been known about for months. Just how big of a blow is it to lose Anderson, and what happens now? All that and plenty more to be discussed. Please give the video a thumbs up if you're watching live on YouTube or afterwards. If you're listening on our podcast channel, hello, please do share the podcast across social media. It's really appreciated. Let's get on with the show. Aaron, how are you keeping? I've heard you've picked up a little bit of an injury.
Honestly, if it's not me knee or me hamstring, it's something else. I sort of wish I'd came into the office today if I was able to, because I'm walking around like the hunchback in Notre Dame. I can't stand up straight. I can't walk straight. Me missus can't stop laughing as well in the house. Just a little back injury, hopefully not too serious ahead of me holiday next week. But other than that, very well. I'm just a little bit concerned we're going to have nothing to talk about this afternoon.
I know I go away on holiday for a week and all hell breaks loose. Just to be clear with our listeners, though, you were playing football, right? And you've pulled your back. That's how it's happened.
Playing football yesterday, felt me back go quite early, played the full game, and then as soon as I got out of the car after driving home, honestly, I'm walking like an 80-year-old man now.
I was going to say, Gosford's very own Callum Wilson there. That's you're taking his title. Did you do park run this weekend?
No, I didn't do park run. I was a little bit hungover Saturday morning, so that got knocked on the head.
28 minutes, 11 seconds. And that's after a week of all-inclusive over in Mallorca, where I've ate my body weight. Because I don't drink, I had to make sure that I got my money's worth via the food, which was excellent. Then I came back and did a park run, and I was quite happy with that. I was thinking it was going to take 35 minutes, lugging all this extra baggage around, but it didn't. 28 minutes suits me very nicely.
Well, I'm very proud that you're coming on here for a change and saying you've done it rather than making excuses. So.
Yes. Anyway, shall we get on with the show? Just sum up the last few days in a sentence or so before we delve into the individual stories and points. What have you made of the last 48 hours at Newcastle United?
Hectic, frantic, frenetic, panic-inducing. I feel like every single time you open social media, there was another transfer story breaking, and I'm sort of sat here in my flat feeling as if I usually feel the day after deadline day. That is generally how it felt. You had this mad scramble of deals needing to be done by June 30th, and it certainly doesn't feel like there's another 2 months to go, the transfer window. It feels like we're done and that's it. So it just goes to show you what a sort of what a crazy set of rules and stipulations this is, that we sort of now got 2 deadline days in a single summer. But I think hectic is probably the word I'd use to describe the last 48, 72 hours.
Yeah, the Premier League would say that these rules were brought in to help the competition of the Premier League, but all it seems to have done is created a really chaotic start to the transfer window. And we'll set out the stall from Newcastle United's point of view. So it looks like Newcastle United had a deficit of somewhere in the region of £60 million, and they feared a point deduction of potentially 10 points, which would be delivered sometime in the new campaign. Now, obviously, with Newcastle not having European football, they feel there's a real chance to go it next season, and get back into the Champions League for the season after, get to at least another cup final and potentially 2. And who knows what might happen in terms of, right at the top of the table. I know that sounds ambitious, but Newcastle United are really aiming high, given they haven't got 3 games in a week to deal with. Now, with 48 hours to go, Newcastle United needed to sell players to make sure they weren't hit by that penalty. And in the end, Yankuba Minteh and Elliot Anderson were the ones to be sacrificed, believed to be around for a collective amount of around £68 million. We'll get into the individual prices and how big of a loss they may or may not be to Newcastle United later in the show. But looking back on the weekend, it really has been crazy. Now, we knew because of January, Aaron, where there were no rivals and even loan deals didn't happen, they found that really tough, that things were tight. And when it came to PSR, Darren Eales, made comments about every player having their price, and Eddie Howe said things as well. And you look back and you can piece everything together now. So perhaps it should come as no surprise that they needed to sell to be within the rules and be within the restrictions. But I think what has caught most people out is just the manner in which it's come about. And I do think few would argue that the description of the last 48 hours, as you said, you've listed plenty of words there, but it just seemed a little bit desperate towards the end. And I think the key question is, how did we end up here?
Look, I think it's something we can probably talk on in more detail as we get into the episode, but I think it doesn't make Newcastle United Chiefs look very good this weekend. As you say, it did smack a little bit of desperation that we were sort of approaching this June 30 deadline. And, by all accounts, on Friday evening with 48 hours to go, Newcastle still hadn't sold anyone and they still had 60 million to find. 35 million for Elliot Anderson, given all that's gone on, is remarkable business, because how on earth they've managed to get a deal that good when Nottingham Forest know that they're under pressure to sell is quite remarkable. But I think just on a wider point about PSR that you just touched on there, I think Johnny's just summed it up really well in our comments here, saying clubs that are in no financial bother need to prove that they can make money by a deadline or risk a points deduction, while clubs that are in £1 million worth of debt can spend freely without confidence. And I think if you look at some of the deals that have gone on in the last couple of days, or nearly went on in the last couple of days, they've managed to agree a deal with Manchester United, who, as many people would point out, are in millions of pounds worth of debt. They've sold Elliot Anderson to Nottingham Forest, who suffered their own points deduction earlier this season. And they were very, very close to selling Yankuba Minteh, one of the most promising talents that they've ever had. They were close to selling him to Everton, who had their own points deduction earlier in the season. There's no wonder that the rules in this league need to be changed, because it's making an absolute mockery of not just the Premier League, but the teams themselves. So yeah, it was a chaotic weekend. I don't think anybody's really came out looking too good. I think the only thing I will say to Newcastle is to get £68 million for Minteh and Anderson, given how little time they had to do these deals and how much pressure they were under. I think that's the only thing that you can really praise them for.
Wireman asks live on YouTube, do you think the feel-good factor at the club is a bit dented now due to the past few weeks? I'm certainly thinking everything in the garden isn't as rosy as it once was. I don't actually think there's been that much of a feel-good factor since the season ended. I think had Newcastle qualified for the Conference League, then there would have been. But I think the fact they didn't get into Europe has left people feeling a bit gloomy. We've spoken about it in recent weeks. So I don't think that the past 40 hours have helped. I think a quick signing, other than the ones we've seen confirmed today, the Nottingham Forest goalkeeper coming in, John Ruddy coming in, and Lewis Hall being confirmed as a Newcastle United player on a permanent basis. I think they need to go out and they need to make a big money signing as soon as possible. And we'll get on to whether they can do that in a moment. But I don't necessarily think, Aaron, and you might argue against me here, that the mood coming into this summer was all that high anyway.
I'm not going to argue against you at all, to be fair. I think, as soon as that FA Cup final finished and Manchester United had somehow beaten Manchester City, it was all pretty much downhill. And we needed some big early news in the summer. Dan Ashworth's replacement, a big name signing. And so far, we've got none. All we've seen so far is Newcastle get rejected for some really big targets, struggle to sell some players that have been trying to sell. And also, look, I know they've signed 4 players so far. Lewis Hall, permanent deal finally concluded. Lloyd Kelly, John Ruddy, and Vlachodimos from Nottingham Forest. But all 4 of those deals, don't scream excitement. They're not going to get fans really positive. So I agree with you. I think the next couple of weeks are crucial. I think that everybody around the club needs a lift. I think the ownership need to show some real intent, some real ambition to get everybody back, on the same page again.
Let's look at Yankuba Minteh then. We both sat here a few weeks ago and said, give the lad a chance. I still stand by that desire if we were in an ideal world, but we're not. If you take away the hope, Aaron, that we all wanted to see that kind of Hollywood movie journey, youngster arrives from nothing, goes on to be a star. But as you said last week and the week before, there's no guarantee that Minteh actually will be the star. The stats suggest he very well could be. I think the fact that Newcastle need a right winger as well makes it a slightly harder deal to accept. But as you've mentioned, £33 million for a guy who's never kicked the ball in the Premier League and had half a good season in Holland. is a price that you can't really turn down. They wanted 40 million. They had 40 million on the table from Lyon. He didn't want to go to France. He wanted Premier League football. So he waited, finally got his move. What have you made of that?
Look, not to blow my own trumpet, but in that podcast that I did last week, I sort of ran through all the options that Minteh could go to, Lyon, Everton, Dortmund and Roma, and I actually said that Brighton looked like the deal that made most sense on paper. Minteh himself wanted a Premier League move. Brighton have got, this fantastic track record of signing young players and turning them into absolute superstars. And Newcastle, the only downside to that move is that they're selling to a Premier League rival. But it was the only way they were going to get that deal over the line. In terms of selling Minteh, I think everybody, in an ideal world, if they had the opportunity, would like to keep him and like to have seen him, get out, at least a run in Eddie Howe's team for the first half of the season. Obviously, we know that wasn't the case. And I think just to put myself in Eddie Howe's shoes, and I think it's something we spoke about the last couple of weeks, if you've got the chance between, trying to sell Yankuba Minteh for 33 million, who's never been a part of your team, or, really struggling to offload Miguel Almirón, who's, in your eyes, a key first-team player, I think it's easy to see why Eddie Howe and the club have seen this as the best way to do it, given the time constraints. My only worry now is that he has an absolute storm for Brighton. We're all sat here saying, how did it get to this point? I don't want to wish the lad to not have a good career, but I'm sort of hoping that it maybe fizzles out a little bit, or he goes abroad and ends up, becoming a superstar, because I think watching him for Brighton and seeing him at St James's Park next season in a different strip is going to be a little bit hard to take.
Yeah, it's going to hurt, especially when that right wing is a priority, and they're likely to spend at least that on whoever comes in. But as you've mentioned there, it was probably the deal that made the most sense, because Eddie Howe hasn't built up this relationship with Yankuba Minteh. You've mentioned before, Arne Slot wants to fire Nord now with Liverpool, speaking about the fact that Minteh struggled to maybe follow instructions. He's not the easiest person to maybe follow up on those instructions. So who knows how that relationship was going to turn out at Newcastle United. I think also the fact that they've made so much profit on Minteh just made it an absolute no-brainer, despite your priority in terms of that right wing, despite the potential of the lad. When you are making, 26 million pound profit on him, and you need to make profit above all else, it had to be done, right?
It did, and I think it's definitely softened the blow. And I think it's similar to Elliot Anderson. I think if we'd seen these two players go for 15 million or 20 million even, because we knew, clubs know Newcastle are desperate, then I think we'd be sat here saying it's an absolute shambles of a deal. But I think the fact that you're getting, as I said, 68 million for these two players, it's really, really softened the blow. Now, I'm sure we're going to get on to Dan Ashworth, and people will no doubt have contrasting views about Dan Ashworth, given how the last 4 months have played out. But he made it his mission at Newcastle United to try and sign these young players. Minteh was obviously one of them. Grant Kowal, I know obviously hasn't gone well, but these were the type of players that Newcastle thought they could pick from pretty much obscurity for quite low figures. I mean, I think they paid 6.5 million for Yankuba Minteh. Now, Ashworth's view was always that these would become future first-team players. But, if you're going to make that much profit on them, then they're sort of doing their job anyway. It's still worked out as a fantastic signing, because Newcastle have made a lot of profit on him. The only downside is that we didn't get him to see him at Newcastle before he ended up going.
It is interesting, though, isn't it? Because that is the model that Brighton follow, and they followed it very well. And that's why they're in the position this summer where they can spend £33 million on Minteh and not really bat an eyelid. But I do think their situation is actually the other side of the coin when it comes to PSR, because it's a great move for him and they have no worries. But I just think that is part of the problem, because you look at Brighton and where they're going to be in 18 months' time. They will have sold 1, 2, 3 of their stars, whether it be Minteh, whether it be Pedro. They will have cashed in and they'll just start the cycle again. It's like a never-ending hamster wheel, and being stuck in it, not really allowing them to build, because I don't think the rules do allow them to build. They will have to sell in 2 or 3 years' time, to make sure they fall within the bracket again. Or, if Liverpool come in or Man City come in for one of their stars, I just think it's a bit of a poor existence, because unless you're Brighton and you manage to get in the top 4 from here or in for the next decade, you're just going to keep going around in the same circle time and time again. I just think it's a bit of a poor existence for a football club.
I just think the entire PSR system as it currently stands is it's just so backwards, because we've got Newcastle United forced to sell a really good homegrown talent in Elliot Anderson, who didn't want to leave the club. Eddie Howe didn't want to sell him, and because he's a homegrown player who came through the academy, Newcastle are actually rewarded in selling him because it's pure profit, and it looks better on the balance sheet. So the whole system needs to change. It's good to see that clubs like Aston Villa and Crystal Palace are trying to get these votes in place where clubs can vote to change the rules. We're obviously going to see a few more things trialed this season. Whether it makes any difference, I'm not sure, but I think you'd be hard pressed to find anybody at this stage who supports any team to say that the current rules are working. And I think what we've just seen in the last 48 hours from Newcastle's point of view, you can guarantee there's going to be absolutely nobody on Tyneside that's thinking that these rules are making life better for any team.
And that comes from two people, in myself and Aaron here, who don't want the rule book ripped up to such an extent where Newcastle can literally just spend as much money as they want. That's not what we want to see. We just want to see something which is a little bit fairer. And whether, Aaron, it is actually, I don't know if is there a need for a full reset? Because you have the likes of Liverpool and Chelsea and Man City where they can spend this amount of money because they've built upon it before these rules are really in place. And whether you need to press the reset button, start everyone on a. It's not going to be a fair playing field because of the amount of money they've got within the club already and the sponsorship deals. But there is something, I think, where you can just press reset, and it makes it a little bit fairer. I don't know what that looks like.
I think
goal, but there's something there.
I think it's definitely above our two pay grades to try and work out what the exact formula should be for it. But I do think that we are starting to see the last couple of months there's this big groundswell from fans, from clubs, from ownerships, even probably from Premier League bosses that see that something needs to change. Now, I don't know whether you then move to a sort of, the revenue model of you can spend X amount of what you bring in. You don't know whether you need to go to, something much similar to what they do in UEFA. I don't know the answer. It's too much of a complex situation for somebody like me to have the exact, remedy for it. So, but look, just to go back to Newcastle United, I think what it will certainly have done in the boardroom at Newcastle United is change the way they think about windows going forward, change the way they think about deals going forward. Because just to rewind a little bit to January, you had 4 or 5 Newcastle United players, key Newcastle United players, linked with moves away: Kieran Trippier, Callum Wilson, Miguel Almirón. For various reasons, none of those players ended up leaving. Howe obviously wanted to keep them because his squad was depleted. Miggy didn't want to go. Trippier wasn't sort of allowed to go to Bayern. But if that had happened and we'd sold Miggy, or we'd sold Wilson, or we'd sold Trippier, yes, it would have damaged them in the short term. But I don't think we would have had this blind panic yesterday. I don't think we would actually have seen Elliot Anderson go. I think they probably could have got away with just getting rid of Minteh, Dan Anderson deal being agreed, and I think that would have been them pretty much over the threshold. So I think it just goes to show, going forward, when they're 6 months away from a deadline like this, and Eddie Howe and the ownership maybe have contrasting views, they'll zoom out a little bit and say, look, we know that we've got this shortfall or this black hole, and I think it'll change them, because it, from the sounds of it, it was absolute panic inside the boardroom in the last couple of days, which they won't want to repeat.
No, they won't. And I still maintain that I would have cashed in on Trippier in January. I know that's very easy to say that sitting here, but I've always maintained that line that you're not going to get the same amount of money from him now. Same with Wilson. Miggy, you might get somewhere near what was offered, but it'd have to be a Saudi deal. And he, as we've discussed in recent weeks, does not want to move to the Middle East because he still thinks he's got something to offer at the highest level here in European football, which is fair play to him. And I think actually it's interesting you mentioned January, because if you look at how their seasons ended, they all had pretty dismal endings to last season. Wilson got a few goals, but he got injured. Trippier just nowhere near the level we've come to expect. He's having an all right Euros, not the best. And Miggy just has gone back to his old self in terms of not having that end product, not scoring, not assisting. So, the value where they were in January is nowhere near the value you're probably going to get this summer. And just we'll go on to Elliot Anderson in a moment, but it's really interesting, the PSR rules, because we look away from Newcastle United. I mean, Aston Villa have had to sell Douglas Luiz, which I think is a huge blow to the Premier League. He is one of the best midfielders in Europe. He's gone to Juventus for £43 million. And you look at it and think, who are we protecting here with these rules? Because actually what you're doing is you're either forcing clubs to sell their best academy players, and Aston Villa have lost another one to Chelsea, who we'll talk about in a moment when it gets, because it's relevant to Anderson, but he's probably going to go there and play next to no minutes, or you're forcing them to sell their best stars to clubs abroad. And I think the whole, we're trying to protect the element of competition, it's not working. What you're doing is you're just losing potential stars of the future, or you're losing actual stars here and now to other teams, and the Premier League is going to be worse off for it.
Yeah, and I think just on the point of the homegrown thing, and it's something that I touched on earlier, thinking about Elliot Anderson, I think, if Elliot Anderson wasn't a homegrown player who came through Newcastle United's academy, I think that it would have completely softened the blow of him going. And I think you would maybe look at it from a completely different angle and say, look, well, he maybe doesn't score as many as he should, and he doesn't maybe impact games as much as he should. But because he was an academy player, we sort of give him a bit more of a chance. We sort of had a different view of him. And I think we're now getting to the stage where these homegrown players and these academy graduates that are coming through, that you really want to do well, the clubs are now seeing such an opportunity to sell them. How good would it have been to see Elliot Anderson completely, become a first team regular under Eddie Howe and completely improve his game and become eventually a Newcastle legend? Are we getting to the stage now where, these type of stories just aren't going to happen because, pure profit and selling homegrown players is just too attractive for the balance sheet? And really, I mean, that goes to a wider point of how you're just ruining football, from an emotional standpoint. And I know I'm probably, going off on a tangent here, but I think the Anderson move really is one that fans really didn't want to see happen. Eddie Howe didn't want to see it happen. And the fact that clubs are now resigned to losing these types of players to look sustainable, when we've just spoken about how the fact that Newcastle United are debt free, they've got owners who are willing to back them. They've got very good sponsorship deals in place. They've got their revenue was up to £250 million last year, and yet they're still not seen as sustainable. Again, it just feels like the rules are just so outdated.
No, they certainly are, and I think it's going to be a long while though before we get the rules that allow clubs to be as competitive as they want on a fair playing field. I mean, look, Eddie Howe did not want to lose Elliot Anderson. Big fan of him. He saw him as a big part of Newcastle United's future. It was a move that was very, very forced, very different to the Yankuba Minteh move, where that was just something that was probably always likely to happen because that relationship's not been built up, as we said, because they're not worked together. But Eddie Howe was a massive fan of Elliot Anderson, and reluctantly, he's been allowed to go to Nottingham Forest. Let's start with that price tag. £35 million, as you've already mentioned, excellent price. I've seen a few fans from other teams question the price tag and ask whether it's fair market value. But if you look at the midfielder from Aston Villa, who I've just mentioned, that Chelsea have signed, Mari Kellyman. Had you heard of him? No.
Nope.
Signed him for was 19 million pounds. 18-year-old, played just 6 times in Aston Villa's first team. Then, considering that price tag, you look at Elliot Anderson, 55 times for Newcastle. I think 35 million pounds is more than fair, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. I think a relatively regular player in Eddie Howe's first team, plenty of Premier League experience. You could also maybe throw in the fact that he's English, and there's that sort of added tax that happens to just go on homegrown players. And I think in today's market, I didn't look at it and think, wow, Newcastle United have really done a dodgy deal there with Forest, and Forest have paid way over the odds. I certainly think it was more than I expected Newcastle to get for him. And I think it was weird. There was a couple of, really, really unconfirmed reports and speculation on social media on Friday night that it was only going to be 10 million or 15 million. You thought, that's a little bit too low. And I think we've probably gone to the other side of the deal now. I think 35 is maybe a little bit on the high side, but I certainly don't think it's anything to warrant, rival fans calling for investigations or anything like that. I think, given his age, given his profile, given that, where you think his ceiling could be, I think Newcastle have done very, very well to get it. But I also don't think Forest have been completely ripped off either.
Andy Ford says, I can't believe we got £35 million for Anderson, an unbelievable deal for a bit part player who hasn't scored a goal in the Premier League. It's the same price that we paid for Bruno. And that leads me on to my next point. When I first saw this story, my initial thought was, oh no, because I really enjoyed watching Anderson play for Newcastle. I think he's got something special about him. But since the deal's been done, I've heard people and read tweets from people saying that, he's nothing special, that it was more a story of a Geordie lad rising through the ranks and making it at the club that appealed more and kind of maybe muddied the waters when it comes to speaking about him. But I totally disagree. I think it's quite amazing how opinions change to suit a narrative. Look, if Anderson hadn't picked up the injury last season, I think he would have been worth more than £35 million. It's kind of my biggest what-if moment last season, because with the injuries Newcastle suffered, Anderson would have been ahead of Miley and he would have been given the chance to shine, and I think he would have taken it. I think he will be a top 6 player and in England's international. So I am really sad to see him go. But Aaron, this is football. We've said it before, there's no room for sentiment. You've got to take the emotion out of it. It's really hard to argue against cashing in for £35 million because there is an argument, as Andy has said there in the comments, what did he really do at Newcastle United to maybe warrant that? As much as I think it is fair and he's maybe worth a little bit more, I can also see the other side of the coin.
Yeah, I really don't want to be the person to, just think now he's gone to start, saying he wasn't anything special. I really enjoyed watching Anderson. It was a real shame that he didn't get a good run in the team last year when there was so many injuries, because I think he could have had a really big part to play. And I think what we've seen with Anderson from when he first came in to the team is that he's really improved. He's looked a lot more comfortable. He can play in a number of positions. My only sort of bugbear with him, and I think it's really softened the exit for me and maybe not lose any sleep over it than I should have, I think, is the fact that, he wasn't a regular goal scorer. He wasn't getting your double figures of assists. He wasn't coming off the bench and massively impacting games. He was a fantastic player. I think he worked very well under Eddie Howe. But I think that is probably the reason that we're seeing so many people on social media sort of say, oh, well, 35 million, you can't grumble with that. And I do think it goes to what I said earlier. I think the fact that he's a local lad in an academy project, an academy graduate, I think that does definitely, give him a lot more benefit of the doubt with some fans, I think, because they wanted him to do well for that reason.
I mean, I've tried to have a little look and haven't had anything firmed up, but it would be really interesting to have it confirmed, or at least nudged in the right direction to whether there's any buyback clauses in either of these deals, because you could see a scenario in which Anderson shines and then heads back to Tyneside at some point in the future when they can afford him and they're after a player in his position. Davey says we had to go through this scenario. It seems from now on, literally, we can grow and grow. Incomings are imminent. A terrific season in the offing. Newcastle United's midfield now, Aaron. Anderson's gone. It's good news for Lewis Miley because that bumps him up the pecking order. Assuming Newcastle hold on to Bruno, you would say it's Bruno alongside Joe Linton. Sean Longstaff to begin with, because Tonali's not available. But when Tonali comes back, it'll be Bruno, Joe Linton, and Sandro Tonali, with Sean Longstaff, Joe Willock, and Lewis Miley providing backup. Do they need another body in that midfield, or is it subscribed? Because I do think Anderson going makes it a worse midfield for me. I look at that backup and you think Tonali's going to take a little while, I think, to get up to speed. You can't rely on Joe Willock. Yeah, well, okay, I'll stick by it. You can't rely on Joe Willock. Sean Longstaff, we have to hope he's over the injury, and he's going to be playing out of his skin to get a new deal because he only got a year left on his contract. Lewis Miley, young lad, still learning the ropes. I look at the backup and I do think they need an extra. They need someone to come in. They had it with Anderson. Now he's gone. I think it's rather ironic, isn't it? They've sold Anderson, who made that midfield stronger, and they're going to have to move the bean counters to go and replace him.
Exactly, yeah. I think just before I answer that question, Andy's made a good point in the comments here on YouTube saying, thank God it wasn't Lewis Miley who went to over the weekend. And I'd be interested to know, people who are listening or watching right now, who they would have preferred actually out of Elliot Anderson or Lewis Smiley going. But to answer your question, we've spoken about this a lot, haven't we, on the pod, about whether Newcastle had too many players in the midfield. And I sort of thought that they did, because, we've been spent the last couple of weeks saying, does Lewis Smiley need to go out on loan? Does Anderson or somebody else need to go? Does Longstaff need to go? I think as it stands, if no one else in that midfield goes, I think they've got enough. Dare I say, I think they've probably got the perfect amount, because if Anderson hadn't gone, we would have been in a situation where Elliot Anderson or Lewis Smiley would be the 6th and 7th choice midfielders. Now that they're both better than being in that position. I know it never works like that, because Newcastle are going to have injuries and suspensions and whatnot, but I think they've got enough. I think if we see someone like Sean Longstaff go, or dare I say, somebody somehow manages to sign Bruno, which I do not think is going to happen this summer, now that that release clause has expired, then I think they'll need another. As it stands, I think they've probably just got the perfect amount. And again, I think it goes back to, yes, Newcastle United are going to be able to spend now. We can probably stop talking about the urgent need for exits, and we can start looking and getting excited about who they can sign now. I think there's a lot more positions that are urgently in need of reinforcements to midfield. I think out wide, up front, centre-back probably takes the priority rather than midfield at the minute.
For me, I would have tried to sell Joe Willock. I would have moved him on ahead of Elliot Anderson if it was possible. I know you don't agree, but that would have been my go-to.
We had this conversation last week, didn't we, when we did we did one of these podcast episodes. I can't remember which one it was, and I know we were in massive disagreement about it. I would like to see Willock given another season to try and overcome his injuries and try and get back to the form that we know he could get. It's been very, very interesting, though, for all this talk about who could go to fulfill PSR requirements. Joe Willock's name has never once been brought up, which I think goes to show just how valuable Eddie Howe thinks he is in this squad. And somebody else has made a very good point in the comments, and it's players that we don't usually mention, but does this now afford the chance to Alfie Harrison? Doesn't now give Travis Hearns or somebody like this the opportunity to come through? Newcastle, as we mentioned earlier in the show, Dan Ashworth, 2 players that he pushed for, at least Travis Hearns. He got over the line last summer. Alfie Harrison came in January. It remains to be seen whether the level of being in the first team. They've both trained with the senior side. Travis Hearns, we obviously saw in Australia in that game where they got absolutely thumped by that A-League side. But I think it'll be very, very interesting to see whether either of those players get a chance against Hull or they get a chance in Japan later this month.
It will be interesting, but I think if you look back on Eddie Howe's track record with youngsters, I don't think you're likely to see them gain more than a few minutes off the bench if everyone remains fit. He's one for really taking his time with getting them ready for first team action, which some people don't like, some people do, but then do you trust the manager? And look, we look at Lewis Hall, he's seemingly got that call right. And he's just become a permanent Newcastle United player. Anderson and Minteh weren't the only 2 targeted, Aaron. We had Alexander Isak wanted by Chelsea and Anthony Gordon wanted by Liverpool, and both had their price, which shows you just how desperate Newcastle United were as that deadline came over the horizon. Now on Gordon, there is some fear that his head has been turned by Liverpool's interest. There's a little bit of debate about how strong Liverpool's interest actually was and whether they might actually come back to the table. It looks like Newcastle United are not interested in starting or restarting any talks. But it's really interesting, isn't it? And if Gordon's head has been turned, boyhood Liverpool fan, Newcastle United are going to find themselves in a really difficult position, aren't they?
Yeah, now that we've had this, really chaotic weekend where, as we've said, nobody really came out of it looking, very good. The hope now is that they can put it behind them and focus on next season, but you do have to worry in case there's been any blowback or there's any damage or fallout from it. And I think what we could see, and obviously, as you say, there's been reports this morning that it has happened or it could happen, is Anthony Gordon, who's away in Germany, who maybe, hasn't had these conversations face to face, and it's been done through agents and the club and representatives. Is he going to now be in Germany thinking, well, Newcastle think that I'm surplus to requirements despite all I've done for them this season? try and push for a Liverpool move, who, as you say, he's got those, boyhood roots to. It's an interesting one. I think on Gordon, I think there was a lot of talk over the weekend that he'd been offered to Liverpool. I think that wasn't the case. I think what we saw with Isak in Chelsea and Liverpool and Gordon was clubs trying their luck with Newcastle and testing their resolve. And I think had Liverpool came in with an offer that Newcastle deemed fit, we could have seen him go. But by all accounts, it doesn't seem like Liverpool were ready to match that, which in a way is a positive because it shows Newcastle weren't just going to sell him on the cheap and face a huge backlash. You get the sense that Gordon's price tag is probably similar to Bruno's in their eyes. And if he does go, Newcastle are going to make sure they get, absolute top dollar for him. For me, it would be an absolute, it would just be so heartbreaking to see him go this summer. You feel like he's just finally coming into his own. You feel like he could be such a huge player in the years ahead. And again, I'd like to get people's thoughts on this. I'd like to get your thoughts on it and people listening and watching. Out of Bruno, Isak, and Gordon, where do you rank them in terms of who do you want to see out of the three go least or most? It's really interesting now because so much has been made about Isak and Bruno staying or going, but I actually think Gordon, in many people's eyes, is more important than at least one of them, maybe.
That's a really difficult question, isn't it? Because you've got Alexander Isak is the goal scorer, and goals are the hardest thing to come by in football. Bruno, the man who pulls the strings in the middle, and Anthony Gordon, who was player of the season for Newcastle in the last campaign. But I think it's interesting, as good as he was last season, that's one season. It's probably his best ever season he's had in the Premier League. If I was him, I would return from the Euros. I would come back to Newcastle this summer. I'd get my head down and I would be working my backside off to prove I can do it on a consistent basis. And Liverpool, I might be a Liverpool fan, but I would look at it and think, Arne Slot coming in, is he going to hit the ground running? I don't think he will do. I think there's a chance we could see a David Moyes after Alex Ferguson scenario where things just go so badly wrong, or at the very best, we see it taking 3 or 4 years. It's going to be a long-term project. I don't think it's going to be instant success. So I don't know why you would force a move away, of course, your boyhood club. He's done that before. He forced his move to Newcastle, of course, from Everton. But I'd like to think he's mature enough. Anthony Gordon, he showed it last season. The way he speaks, he's very switched on. That he knows he's onto a good thing here. He knows that while there were talks with Liverpool, it's not something Newcastle United were willingly doing. It was out of necessity.
Yeah.
That he was being talked about. And he hopefully understands that. And he hopefully understands how much Eddie Howe loves him and the fan base love him here as well. Now, he should stay and become a hero at the club because he's already halfway there. As for Alexander Isak and Chelsea, it's absolutely laughable that Chelsea are in such a position that they can afford to even knock on the door and ask the question, really. It's a shame we don't have a hotel or two, isn't it, Newcastle United, to sell on. I don't think that deal was ever going to happen. I think it's a lot easier to persuade someone like Tosin to join Chelsea over Newcastle when you're already settled in West London, when maybe money's more important. But I think when you're already at Newcastle United, you've bedded in, you've been a success. I think it's a lot more difficult to persuade Isak to leave Newcastle for Chelsea, because the one question he'll be asking is, what's the project? What's the end goal? How many managers have Chelsea had in recent years? You've just let one go, one of the best managers in world football. You've replaced him with someone who's never managed in the Premier League before. You've given him the same directive that Pochettino had, and in the end of last season met. It's chaos. So if I was Isak, I'd be looking at what the project is and seeing the project here at Newcastle and saying, this is where I want to be.
Yeah, well, I know we're obviously maybe a little bit biased and we've got the black and white spectacles on, and it's the similar conversation that we had when Tosin was obviously choosing Chelsea over Newcastle. But for me, I don't see much difference in either of the two clubs. This isn't a Liverpool or a Manchester City or, dare I say, an Arsenal coming in for Isak. It was Chelsea who, you never know who are going to finish above Newcastle or not, with the direction that the two clubs are going at the minute. As you say, there's a lot of turmoil on and off the pitch for them. They change the managers. They just seem to be buying players left, right and centre. I don't think the move was ever a non-starter. I think it was a case of Chelsea trying their luck with Newcastle and seeing, just how desperate they were to sell. Isak seems very, very settled personally in Newcastle. He's been saying all the right things in public about wanting to stay and being happy. And I think keeping Gordon and Bruno will only strengthen Isak's belief that Newcastle is the right team for him, because they aren't having to sell these the best players to make ends meet. So again, I think it was a case of Chelsea sensing some panic from Newcastle and thinking, you know what, let's see how desperate they really are. But very, very good to see that all three of them are staying. And I think just on Bruno, Gordon and Isak, I think now that June 30th has passed and we're starting to see the dust settle a little bit, I can't see any of them going. You could maybe have understood it last week if the deal was right, but I don't think we'll see it now between now and September.
I hope you're right, but I'm not fully convinced that Gordon, Bruno, and Isak, I'm not convinced all three will still be here at Newcastle coming the window. I don't know. I think the Gordon thing's really interesting. If his head has been turned, that's going to play out for a little while. It's certainly going to be an interesting summer to see what happens. But fingers crossed, you are correct in that. Look, there's been plenty of questions about, I mean, first of all, before the point I want to make as well, I think Isak, the reason why the project matters over the money is because I think he's going to get a new deal at Newcastle anyway. Newcastle recognise his value. They recognise how important he is. I don't think a new deal will be too far away, just to, if anything, protect their value and protect their position for one of the hottest strikers in European football. But there has been questions, Aaron, about communication from the board, and I'm going to defend them here because I question what good it would have done coming out in the last week of June and admitting that you were screwed, essentially. Admitting you need to sell to avoid a points deduction. It leaves potential buyers knowing that you're desperate, so they'll undercut you. It puts the doubt among the players about their future here, and then it just sets panic amongst the fan base. So I actually think keeping quiet up until this deadline is passed was the right thing to do. What we now need to see, and I think this will happen sooner rather than later, is someone to come out and explain just what happened, how we got into this position, and what the future now holds. And I think that will happen in the next kind of few weeks. I think it'll happen before the month's out, where we will hear from someone, whether it be Darren Eales, Peter Silverstone, whoever. They'll come out and they'll explain what happened and why the future is still very bright in Newcastle. But as for the criticism about not coming out already, I just don't see what the benefit would have been.
Well, I think we'll probably hear from Eales rather than anyone about the direction that the club's going, and maybe settling some of the rumours about what's happened over the last 48 hours. I think I would argue that the club, made the situation abundantly clear when Darren Eales came out back end of last year, start of this year, and said every player has their price. And then Eddie Howe came out in the press in January and said there's literally no money to do any deals. I think, yes, it's taken us by surprise that the amount Newcastle had to sell over the last couple of days, but I don't think it was in any doubt that they needed to sell for PSR. And I think it was maybe just a case of fans not wanting to hear it when we got told about it 6 months ago. I don't think the club board or any of the club chiefs, Silverstone, Eales, Staveley, had any real necessity to come out in the last couple of days and explain the situation. I think, as you said quite rightly there, I think it would have probably just added to the panic and added to the fact that clubs maybe thought they could pull a fast one on Newcastle, which I don't think's happened at all with the deals that they have done. But I think you're right. I think we probably will hear from one of them in the next couple of weeks.
The other question that's been asked, Aaron, is where do we go from here? They recouped nearly £70 million if you throw in the Dan Ashworth compensation that Man United have now agreed with Newcastle United, which has, we believe, come in time to meet that PSR deadline, which is a massive boost to them. Where do they go now with these funds? Just what can they spend?
Well, look, it's still very uncertain as to how much they can actually spend. But one thing is for certain is that the attention now will be on arrivals. One thing I will say with that is that, don't expect there not to be sales. I think what we'll definitely see is some of these first team players going, and I think they'll range in terms of how much you're actually going to get for them. I suspect we're going to talk about the goalkeeper situation before the episode's out, so we can touch on Dubravka more there, but I think he will go. I think I wouldn't be surprised to see at least 2 of 3 of Wilson, Trippier, Miggy, if not all 3, dare I say, leave. But I think what we'll definitely see now, Newcastle-wise, is spending this month, and I think there's a couple of reasons for that. That Adidas deal being on this balance sheet is going to be absolutely huge. It's going to give them a massive financial boost. And also, given that PSR is obviously a 3-year rolling period where you can't make a loss of over 105 million, the 21-22 accounting year is now out the way. It's in the rear view window. And when you look back at what Newcastle spent that year, that was obviously the year where they spent big money on Bruno, Trippier, Chris Woods, all those players in January. And obviously that was the first year of post-takeover spending. So there's definitely more wiggle room now. The fact that Newcastle have obviously had such a big hole to fill in the last couple of days doesn't fill you with confidence, but at least now we know that attention can turn to actually signing some players rather than having to sell, very, very quickly.
And as we've mentioned, the right wing is the priority. Michael Elise was seemingly top of the list. He's going to go off to Bayern Munich. The names that have continually been mentioned, and we know Newcastle really like Anthony Elanga, who I mentioned a few weeks ago and got a load of stick for it, but I stick by it because I think he's such an exciting player. He was reportedly thrown into the initial deal for Elliot Anderson before things went towards the £35 million price tag. He'd be so exciting. From what I understand, he'd be also open for a move to Newcastle United, which is always a good starting point, but it's the price tag which matters now. But the relationship there between Forest is really good. Obviously, Chris Wood, John Joe Shelby, now Elliot Anderson, and obviously the goalkeeper coming the other way. So you suspect if they can sort out a deal, that one might happen quite quickly. Would you take Elanga at Newcastle United?
I'm surprised to hear that you got some stick for your Elanga shout. To be fair, maybe people just like giving you stick for anything you say, but I think Elanga would actually be a very exciting signing. Tore Newcastle apart last time when they played him last season. Very young, very, very exciting, and I think every time I watched him for Forest last year, I just sat there thinking, how on earth did Manchester United get to the stage where they thought he was the wide man to get rid of, and then you go and spend 80-90 million on Anthony. So very exciting. As you say, it's one of those where if you're Forest, do you want to sell him? He's a big asset, and I think he'd cost a lot of money. And I think the fact that Forest have probably just gone and spent 35 million on Anderson, they can ask for a lot more for Anthony Elanga.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I look at Forest, and if they manage to hold on to Elanga, Morgan Gibbs-White, Murillo. Now, there's nothing to say they will do, because they probably will need to have a big sale at some point as well, at least one of those players. They've got a very, very tasty-looking squad. They could break into that top 10 quite easily. Yeah, and there's some talented players down the City Ground.
They got ridiculed, didn't they, when they came up and they spent all that money? But I think now that all these players have had a bit of time to bed in, and obviously Nuno seems to have found his best team, I think they're going to be really exciting. And I think for Anderson, it's actually a really good move. Yes, he's leaving his boyhood club, and there'll be a lot of emotion around that. But actually, he's joining a team that you suspect, should be a Premier League team for at least the next couple of years. So yeah, look, I'd take Elanga. If I'm completely honest, I know he's probably more of a left winger than a right winger, but I'd love Callum Hudson-Odoi as well, who I think's really revived his career down at Forest after some tricky times away from Chelsea. Right wing, as you said, now looks to be the priority. It looks like we'll probably see some movement in the next couple of weeks with Miguel Almirón. Obviously, the fact that Yankuba Minteh isn't, going to be fighting for that spot only adds for me to the fact that has to be the priority. If you've got if you've got this big bit of money that you need to spend on a marquee signing, go and spend it on a right winger so that you've got a very expensive, exciting right-sided attacker. You've got Alexander Isak through the middle, and you've got Anthony Gordon down the left, and you've got a really, really damaging front three. As we touched on earlier, I don't really think the midfield is a massive priority at the minute, but I think centre-back as well, they probably go out for someone, and I think if Callum Wilson goes, then what we've seen in the last couple of weeks is that they're definitely pushing for a centre forward. I just hope that it's not Dominic Calvert-Lewin.
We'll get onto that in a moment. Brian Mbeumo is the other name that's been strongly linked. Newcastle have also watched him. Either one of those two would be absolutely excellent. While we've been on air, Keith Downey of Sky Sports has revealed that Newcastle are in talks with Saudi Pro League club over the sale of Miguel Almirón. It's not known which club it is, but talks have been going on about the sale of Miguel Almirón. From where I'm sitting, from where I'm standing, people you talk to, Newcastle can have all the talks in the world, I think, with Saudi pro clubs, but it's going to have to be one heck of a wage packet. And we know the Saudi clubs can do it to persuade Miguel Almirón to move over to Saudi Arabia. I think I do not see him moving. And look, I'll be so glad to get pelters in the comments when it's announced in 4 hours that he's now moved to wherever in Saudi Arabia. But sitting here, I just think he fully believes in himself that he's still got something to offer Newcastle United, or he's still got something to offer in the Premier League, or maybe in Saudi, wherever. I just don't think he's going to want to, at least willingly, unless he gets paid a lot of money, to move to Saudi Arabia.
Well, you've got somebody in the comments here that agrees with you, because Darren Lee says, I can't see Miggy going to Saudi Pro League either. So, look, we know there was interest in January. Newcastle didn't actually receive a firm offer, but there was definitely interest from Al Shabaab in Saudi Arabia. And Miggy said, look, I want to stay. And he's currently with Paraguay at the Copa America, and he gave an interview last week about St. James's Park, and there was absolutely nothing in that interview to suggest that he wants to go. It was all positive. He was praising the fans. He was saying how much he loves St. James's Park, loves the club. But look, how many Premier League players who have been playing week in, week out in the Premier League have we seen move to Saudi? I know you say it's got to be a big wage packet, but the money that these teams can offer is life-changing. And maybe he says, look, I know I'm settled in England and we've got a young family and I love playing for Newcastle, but the money's just too good to turn down. I think at the minute it still does maybe seem like a complicated deal to pull off for Saudi Arabia, but I think it's one that makes sense. I think Almirón, as we've said for weeks, is a sellable asset, and I think you need to upgrade at that right wing, and I don't think Miguel Almirón is the player to fill that position week in, week out for Newcastle United.
I think that's the only place I could... that the teams from Saudi are the only team that I could see affording him. I don't think someone like Ipswich could afford him. Don't know whether you'd get what you'd want price tag wise from a team in Italy. So when it comes to getting a decent price from him, I think it is only Saudi that would offer that. But whether he would go is another question. He's received some stick over the last 48 hours as Miguel Almirón, and it has been absolutely disgraceful to see. No matter what you think about him and his footballing ability, some of the comments from some pretty big fan accounts on Twitter have been abusive and very, very unnecessary towards him. It's his choice. He's got a contract. He can choose to leave. He can choose to stay. He wanted to stay. He's given his all for Newcastle United. Always gives 100%. Might not always put the ball in the back of the net or get that assist. Okay, he's not been the most prolific. But at the end of the day, he pulls on that black and white shirt and plays like he was born on the banks of the Tyne. And we should always be applauding players who give their all for this club. And I think, some of those accounts who've tweeted what they did over the last couple of days need to hang their head in shame, really. Yeah,
look, I think a lot of people will probably have already seen it, but if not, then it's worth reading what Alan St. Maximin said in reply to one fan on Saturday, where he says, I know this message is meant to be positive towards me, but every situation is different. Please show gratitude and respect to Miggy. He's such a good person who has always given his all for Newcastle. Now, obviously, that was some fan account saying that if Miggy hadn't have gone, if Miggy had have gone in January like Maxi did last year, then Newcastle wouldn't be in that situation. It's not as easy as that at all. Yes, we've said Anderson probably wouldn't have had to go if someone had left in January, but Miggy's well within his right to say, I don't actually want to go and play in Saudi Arabia, and Eddie Howe really wants me to stay here, so I'm going to. So I think it goes back to what we say about Miggy pretty much every week, isn't it? That he's the scapegoat, and he does seem to get a lot more abuse or a lot more criticism than other players. Look, it's a tricky one this summer. I sort of hope he goes just for him, because I think he could do with a fresh start, and I would. I think it probably works for all parties at this stage of his career. But as we've just said, I think it's a very, very complicated exit to materialise for Newcastle.
Yeah, it certainly is one to watch. And just before we talk about Trippier and a few others, on Forest, now they received a 4-point deduction last season for around a £30 million deficit, maybe a little bit more, maybe a tiny little bit less. Now Newcastle United, if you speak to, there was no way they wanted to have a point deduction, as I've explained earlier in the show. Next season is going to be the season they go for it. But you look at what Forest have managed to have done, right? You know, they took the points deduction, survived in the Premier League, have got a team, as we've mentioned, full of stars who they've managed to hold on to. They'll build a very good core. They've then gone out and splashed money on one of the Premier League's rising stars. Look, a 10-point deduction, no way accepting that. But I do wonder, you know, if it was a 4-point deduction, 3-point deduction, how many people would have accepted that and said, "We'll keep Elliot Anderson and we'll take the hit on the points"?
Yeah, but look, I was looking before a 10-point deduction in the season that Newcastle finished in the Champions League would have had them finishing 7th. Last season it would have had them finishing 10th, which wouldn't really have mattered because it didn't make Europe anyway. It's probably going to cost you 3 or 4 places. I'm sorry, I'll never accept that. And also, if you think Everton, I think, got a 10-point deduction, which eventually got appealed and reduced, but that was for a £19.5 million breach. Newcastle, you know, were probably looking at a huge deduction, well into double figures for their black hole that they needed to fill, and they had to fill it.
Do we know if there's a consistency when it comes to the punishment? Like, I've tried to have a look, and I can't see that there's a set line. You know, it's not like it's a point for every 2 million you're in deficit, right?
No, I don't think so. I think it depends on the circumstance, because obviously it's interesting because obviously Everton had this pretty big breach. I mean, you know, just under 20 million is a decent size financial breach. But then you had Forest, who actually said, "Well, look, we've tried really hard to sell Brennan Johnson to Tottenham, and we just couldn't get it done in time. So that would have solved all our problems." And we did eventually sell him. So Newcastle, you know, I think a lot of it over the weekend, it was them looking like they were really interested in selling, and obviously they've managed to sell anyway, so it doesn't matter. But I think just looking as if you're going to sell was going to massively help them. But still, back to the point about the points deduction itself, you can't seriously say that, you know, a 10-point deduction would be worth it just to spend at will and keep Elliot.
Oh, not a 10-point, no way. But I do wonder if some fans might have looked at it and thought, because it does stick in the teeth somewhat when you've got Forest able to buy up one of your future stars after last season breaking the rules and being hit by a point deduction. I don't know. It just doesn't sit well. I know they've paid the penalty, they've paid the price, so you kind of a clean slate and what have you. But there should be some consistency really when it comes to maybe the points deduction that you get. Maybe it should be, you know, for every 2 million euro where you get a point. I don't know. But anyway, we'll dive into some of the questions that I've got on social media. Rob asks, how much of a setback is a weekend like this one? 2 promising players gone. PS are sorted for the moment, but how much of a blow is it?
It's a blow, but I think it's... Look, I think there's 2 ways to look at it. I think Newcastle have got off quite lightly in the sense that they haven't sold any of their big key players. They didn't have to sell Bruno or Gordon or Isak. On the flip side, as we've said at the very top of the show, you know, nobody came out of it looking good. They didn't come out looking professional. It was all seemed very chaotic. But then also, just to flip back again, you know, you've managed to get 35 million for Elliot Anderson and 33 million for a player who's never kicked a ball for you. So there's 2 ways to look at it. I think they've done very well to keep the players that they have, the players they definitely wanted to keep. But also, I don't think it was a good look for the club either.
We've got loads of questions coming in. Eric says, how much of the tension in the fan base is simply due to the fact that through the Ashley years, financial realities passed us by? As in terms of like they didn't have these issues because Ashley didn't spend anything.
Yeah, look, I think after 14 years of Mike Ashley, where there was never anything to get excited about, and all of a sudden you've got this brand new ownership who have done fantastic things, made fantastic choices, made Newcastle United 10 times better than they were. We're still then sort of, you know, having to watch players like John Ruddy sign for Newcastle United, and that's nothing against John Ruddy, and I completely understand why Newcastle United have gone out and done that deal, because, you know, he's going to offer a lot in the dressing room and he's very, very experienced, and it's what Eddie Howe wants to essentially replace Loris Karius. But it's not the type of signing that screams, you know, richest club in the world, massively wealthy owners, you know, club that's going to get straight back in the Champions League. So I can understand why there is a little bit of frustration around those type of deals, but I also understand why these deals are being done. And I also think they'll swiftly be forgotten about if Newcastle go out and get a couple of big name, exciting, big hitters as well.
Well, Kiki on Twitter does make that point, Aaron. It says, not a question, but any signings we make this window should improve the starting 11 and not the squad. With no European football, it's a possibility we could have 4 or 5 games a month, so not much rotation needed, just impact subs. Do you think that's what Eddie Howe and the transfer team are going to go for? It's going to be players who, come that opening game against Southampton, are going to be the first name on the team sheet?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we could quite easily see 2 or 3 new players in between. Sorry, on the starting 11 for that first game of the season. I think what we've seen so far is they've built the depth. Obviously, Lloyd Kelly comes in; he's very versatile. He is seen as it probably sounds stupid me saying it because he's 25, but he's probably a player for the future in the sense that they've signed a player who they know they can get a good 6, 7, 8 years out of. And then the rest of the deals, the 2 goalkeepers they've signed over the weekend and Lewis Hall is probably more squad depth than first team. But I think now that they've got PSO out the way and they've got a brand new accounting year to attack, then I think we'll start to see some of the big names come in for the starting 11.
Kev says, losing Anderson isn't a blow. If he wasn't a Geordie, everyone would be absolutely thrilled that we sold the player for 35 million. Gary says, quite hilarious that PSR rules are there to stop clubs getting in financial difficulty, and yet point deduction could possibly cause a club to end up in financial difficulty or relegation. Talk about the goalkeeper situation then. I mean, John Ruddy has signed Birmingham City. It was his last club. He's played for Norwich as well. We've also seen, and I love the fact that Newcastle United were going to go for a Valencia goalkeeper whose name I would struggle to pronounce. And then they've gone and got a goalkeeper whose name I definitely cannot pronounce, but I'll have a go anyway. After weeks of learning how to pronounce the Valencia goalkeeper name, I'm now going to try and pronounce this one. Odasias Vladadoshmus. I hate getting them wrong. Go on, have a go.
Is it funny? Is it bad that as soon as Newcastle signed him, the first thing I thought was, I can't wait to hear Muzz say this on the pod?
Do you know what? I put too much pressure on myself when it comes to names. Vlagadomias?
I'm going to go Vlachodimos is what I'm going for.
Okay. What is happening with the goalkeeper situation? Because, we all thought James Trafford was going to be the number 2 battling Nick Pope for the first team spot. £60 million. We were confident. Then Burnley wanted a little bit more money. We thought that was going to get done. I mean, that was only last week. Surely now, even if Martin Dubravka leaves, which we think he will do, you cannot see Newcastle United splashing £20 million or thereabouts on James Trafford when you've just brought in 2 other goalkeepers.
Yeah, look, I think the last 48 hours has massively changed. What happens with the goalkeeping department? I think when Vlachodimos was signed over the weekend, I think a lot of people thought he was coming in to replace Karius and be third choice. But actually now, with them signing John Ruddy, I think it's essentially John Ruddy comes in for Karius, and I think Vlachodimos is potentially Martin Dubravka's replacement. And that, for me, probably defeats the need to sign James Trafford, especially considering Burnley want 20 million. And you can then go and put that 20 million towards a position that you actually need to strengthen. It's perfect timing that Craig has just put in the comments. Ex-Benfica goalkeeper, plenty of Champions League experience, comes in as the number 2. I think if you completely disregard what he did at Forest last year when he played a handful of games and wasn't very well received, and you go back to what he's done for Greece and what he's done for Benfica, Champions League quarter-finalist a couple of seasons ago, it's a very shrewd move for a very small fee. There's one other theory that I want to put you, though, that's been floated about. Now, I don't think this is going to happen, but it's very interesting that somebody made the point on Twitter today. Could we potentially see the situation that Newcastle's goalkeeping department is Gillespie, John Ruddy, Vlachodimos? They then go out and sign Mamadashvili from Valencia as the number 1, and they sell Nick Pope.
Nick Pope has been linked to Ipswich.
Yeah.
Could you really see that? I mean, that would be, when we talk about the goalkeeper situation, if Marshall really came in, he would be the number 1. There's no question about it. Been tremendous in the Euros for Georgia. Big outlay. And I couldn't get my head around the fact of bringing him in and saying to him, as much as we can't guarantee you written on paper, you'll be number 1. but you will be number one. Nick Pope, would have to be moved on, in my opinion. You want 2 top goalkeepers, but I don't think Nick Pope would be sitting on his hands and waiting around for cup games. I think he would want to go. And if Ipswich came in and found the money for him, and he was, he couldn't get the answers off Eddie Howe with a guarantee about first team football, then it would make sense. But given the other priorities, given the way the Valencia goalkeepers played in the Euros for Georgia, can you really see that deal happening?
Well, look, like I say, that wasn't me saying I think it's going to happen, but I think it was a very interesting theory, and it's not out of the realms of possibility. The one thing I would say against that is Eddie Howe loves stability, and he loves, we hardly ever see these huge revamps at Newcastle United and Eddie Howe. He likes to keep the bulk of the squad together. So for him to go from that to suddenly getting rid of Martin Dubravka, Loris Karius, and Nick Pope from his goalkeeper department, I think would be, quite a risky move. So I can see it being Pope number 1, Vlachodimos number 2, John Ruddy number 3, and Mark Gillespie with the greatest job in the world as number 4.
Yeah, it's not a bad job, is it? We mentioned Kieran Trippier. Reports that he was still being touted around, just hours before England faced Slovakia in the Euros. Again, as I mentioned, I would have cashed in. I still think there's a strong possibility that he might not be a Newcastle United player come the end of the window. It's quite telling, though, isn't it, that the likes of Wilson, Trippier, Miggy, there wasn't that much. I don't know what the right term for it is. There wasn't that much interest or rumor or reports about them over the last 48 hours when things are really kicking up a gear. Where were their potential suitors on Friday and Saturday?
I think the one thing to say about that is all of those players have been linked, and I could really see going to Saudi Arabia, and the fact that their window doesn't open until July 1st, has that maybe had an impact on the fact that you get those deals done, before PSR. I mean, Callum Wilson, to be fair, has been linked with a lot of clubs, not just Saudi Arabian clubs, and clubs in the MLS. West Ham have also inquired about him, so there's plenty of suitors for him. But as you say, none of those players that were linked with moves away in January have ended up going to satisfy those PSR obligations.
I mean, Callum Wilson today, according to Luke Edwards in the Telegraph, looks likely to stop after talks for Dominic Calvert-Lewin broke down, which I'm not exactly too upset at. Replacing one person with a bad injury record and bringing in another isn't really my idea of an upgrade. Again, you trust the transfer team and you trust the decisions of Eddie Howe, but if it's going to be a striker, I would like to see someone with a bit of injury record coming in for Callum Wilson. As I said, Trippier for me, I think will go. Miggy up in the air a little bit. Wilson, I would like to see go for a decent amount of money, 10, 12 million, but then the good old question that we always ask is how much it's going to cost you to replace him. Lewis Hall, permanent deal, no surprise there.
Yeah.
Really impressed towards the end of last season. Will he be first choice left back?
Ask me again in 6 weeks when I see whether Newcastle have signed a left back.
Goodness me, you just love sitting on the fence.
No, look, I think anybody that's listened to this pod knows my thoughts about it, and I like to put myself in Eddie Howe's shoes, and I think he will. I think he reluctantly played, not reluctantly. Reluctantly is not the right word. I think he played Lewis Hall as the first choice left back at the back end of last season because Dan Burn had moved to centre half, and I think had they not had those issues at centre back, I don't think we would have seen Lewis Hall get half as much game time. Don't think he would have unseated Burn. And I just think maybe again he starts with Burn because that's what he knows.
Yeah, that's my instinct as well. I mentioned that in the episode with John Gibson last week. I think I could say either new left back coming in or Dan Burn starting at left back against Southampton with Lloyd Kelly and Shea, the centre back pairing. Quite telling though, in these so-called talks for Anthony Gordon, that there was the report that potentially the right-sided central defender from Liverpool, Kwanzaa, is it was talked about.
Joe Gomez as well.
Yeah,
I think what we've seen the last couple of weeks certainly is a lot of interest or a lot of names. A lot of names being linked with Newcastle from centre back. They've been linked with a lot of players from Italy, Tomori, Malik Thiaw, another one from AC Milan. Juventus seem to be using their name a lot to get some of the interest out for their players. I wouldn't be surprised if we see a big arrival to sort of be the right-sided centre half after Kelly came in.
Ian says you need to borrow some tweezers to get the splinters out your backside, Aaron. I didn't pay him for that comment. That's just, he recognises that you sit on the fence far too often. Do you foresee a move happening quickly for an Alanga, for maybe a Tomori, for whoever? I think more than anything, just to settle the nerves of Newcastle United fans, just to pick them up a little bit.
Just to get the morale up a little bit, maybe, just to get bodies through the door. We know, Eddie, how in previous windows they've moved very, very quickly to get big name players through the door. The likes of Pope and that came through the door really, really early. We know they can also go really, really deep into the window, and Eddie Howe, isn't against signing players in August, but he'll want the bulk of his squad ready for when they go to Japan at the end of this month. And I think they're also, set to go to Germany as well, midway through July as well. He'll want the bulk of his players there if they're not on holiday after international duty. So I wouldn't be surprised whether we see maybe one or two big name players through the door by that point, certainly by the end of the month.
And really interesting. So obviously we've already covered it, but lots of questions have been asked about how Newcastle United ended up in such a situation where they were scrapping around. But I think it's probably important to point out the fact that when the takeover happened, the commercial revenue was so down that the owners kind of found themselves in a bit of a difficult position where they knew this would come down the line, so to speak, but also they looked at the squad and thought, goodness me, this is so understaffed to the level where we can literally just compete for the top 10, let alone the top 4. So they had to spend a boatload of money to build a squad competing at a certain level with the knowledge that the commercial revenue to kind of offset it wasn't there. And I don't necessarily think mistakes have been made. I just think they maybe looked at it and thought, this is going to come down the road at some point and bite us in the behind, but we're going to just have to take it on the chin.
I just to put another theory out there, I wonder if maybe they thought they would have maybe another commercial deal over the line, or maybe they thought they would have another avenue explored. That didn't mean they had to go down the player sales route. I think another thing that maybe would have played into the thinking of it is if Bruno goes before the deadline of his release clause, if somebody matches that £100 million release clause, we don't need to sell Minteh, we don't need to sell Anderson, we don't need to be scrambling around on the last weekend of June to try and sell someone. Nobody's came in for Bruno, and then all of a sudden they've thought, okay, well, now we need to get our skates on. Because even before the weekend, even early last week, there was lots of talk about Minteh. They were trying to get him gone to Everton. They were trying to obviously get him to go to Lyon, where he didn't want to go. I just wonder whether the Bruno staying has obviously not accelerated, but forced them into this late panic, and also the fact they maybe thought they had another couple of deals up their sleeves that they haven't been able to get over the line as well.
And we'll finish off on the news. Dan Ashworth to Manchester United. Finally, compensation package has been agreed. They haven't got the £20 million, and you always said, Aaron, they're not going to get £20 million, but they certainly have got more than the £2 million that Man United laughably offered not so long ago. We don't know the exact numbers, but it looks like whatever it has been is probably double figures, and it's been a big boost that it's come under the PSR deadline. More than anything, just good to get the saga shut down once and for all, isn't it?
If I'm completely honest, the main positive of this deal for me is just not having to hear Jim Ratcliffe anymore slag Newcastle off in public and say that they're being awkward, because the way he's gone about it has been absolutely ridiculous. Look, good for all parties to get it over the line. Newcastle United obviously get their compensation, not as much as they were going to want to get. Manchester United finally get their man. He can start work straight away. The saga's done. Newcastle can go and find his replacement and get him through the door. So yeah, good to finally draw a line under it seems.
Do you think they've got someone ready to a point? We know they were conducting interviews and they had a short list and various names have been touted about. Dougie Freedman was the one that obviously people are very aware of. How quickly do you think they'll appoint his successor?
Yeah, they were really, really keen on Dougie Freedman, and Steve Parish at Crystal Palace, really, really tried hard to get Freedman to stay and managed to persuade him to stay down at Selhurst Park. We know that Johannes Spores, who has close links to 777, maybe a little bit controversial. He's been linked. He was the front runner. It looked like they were going to get this deal, over the line one way or another for whoever they're going to bring in a couple of weeks ago. Then it's all gone silent, obviously, as they focus their attention to getting players out the door. Now you suspect that July's turned around and they've got Ashworth over the line. They know the compensation fee. They can now, get these deals finalised and get somebody in to replace them.
One to watch, and hopefully they can get that person in sooner rather than later, and maybe just get someone in who can start pulling strings again and help Steve Nixon out there, who's obviously the man for the talent, but not necessarily maybe the man with the know-how in terms of what Dan Ashworth brought to the club. Because whatever you think about Dan Ashworth, he was one of the best in the business, and that's exactly why Man United have paid quite a bit of money from in the end. And we'll finish off on something, Alan, that I'd love to get your opinion on. It appears the signage at St James's Park, the Newcastle United that is on the East Stand, is coming down. It was replaced to a font that mirrored Sports Direct under Mike Ashley. It's long been the annoyance of some fans and people that have called for it to return to the old font. And it looks like that's going to happen. The club have tweeted out a little teaser. Were you that bothered by it, Aaron? Are you happy to see it?
I was never bothered by it in the sense that I never lost any sleep over it. But when you look at the two fonts side by side, it looks so much better the way it used to. It looks so much better, and that's how I remember it growing up. And it also just feels like it's maybe symbolic that it's the last reminder of Mike Ashley finally gone. But I must say, I did mention it to one of our colleagues earlier, and he said, I didn't even know it had ever changed. So how many people actually, lose any sleep over it, then I'm not sure. But very good to see that they're listening to the fans, because Darren Eales was actually asked about this on BBC Radio Newcastle a couple of years ago, and he sort of said, I have no idea what you're talking about, but we're going to look into it. And he's finally stuck with his word 2 years later. So good to see that they're still making changes.
Hey, it's the little things that matter. I mean, one of the best live videos we ever did on Facebook on Chronicle NFC was when I took a video of them cleaning the windows, and it went viral. So it's the little things that matter alongside the big money signings. Thank you to everyone who has tuned in today. It's been an absolute pleasure to try and make some sense of the last 48 hours at Newcastle United. Please give the video a thumbs up if you're watching on YouTube. Share it amongst your Newcastle United supporting friends and family. If you listen on the podcast, thank you as always. Leave us a rating and review, and also share it across Facebook, Twitter, and wherever you feel like you can do. We do appreciate your support as always. Head over to chroniclelive.co.uk for all the latest Newcastle United news, including our daily transfer live blog. Plenty of things going on in there. Rumours, gossip, concrete stories, opinion analysis, everything you need to take you through to the new season. It's been a pleasure as always. And for myself and Aaron, we'll see you guys very, very soon.